Comic Boom.
Hey guys, Comic Boom here to review Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen #1. Now, straight up, I would not be reviewing a Jimmy Olsen comic. The only reason I am is because I have a tremendous amount of respect for Matt Fraction. Matt Fraction, I loved his work on Hawkeye. I loved what he did with Hawkeye. And I was really curious to see what he was going to do with Jimmy Olsen. I've also heard really good things about Matt Fraction. Apparently, he's talking regularly with Greg Rucka and Brian Bendis about the Daily Planet in general, and about how those characters of Lois Lane, Clark Kent, and Jimmy Olsen, how they get along and how they deal with each other. So I was really curious to see what Matt Fraction's take was on Jimmy Olsen. Now we got a little bit of a tease in terms of how he was going to approach Jimmy Olsen in the I think it was the Leviathan one shot. There was a little bit of a tease there where Jimmy Olsen confronted Dexstar, the Red Lantern cat, and he was ended up covered in blood, and he ended up essentially helping to reveal, I believe, Talia al Ghul as being part of the whole Leviathan fiasco ongoing plot line. In any event, I was really curious to see what this was, what Matt Fraction's take was going to be on Jimmy Olsen. And I got to tell you here, I've got mixed feelings about it. Now, it was interesting because I listened to Professor Bill's review of Jimmy Olsen #1, and he absolutely was very, very disappointed with it. He thought it was, well, I encourage you to go watch Professor Bill of Comic Book University, go watch his review of Jimmy Olsen #1. He's got a fairly scathing review. He doesn't really like it. I'm going to be more kind to it. I actually enjoyed this more than I thought that I would. I was hoping that Matt Fraction would take a little bit more of a grounded and serious approach to Jimmy Olsen, because one of the things about Jimmy Olsen, if you look at the late Silver Age, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen's comic books were always a little bit zany. He was always getting into crazy, ridiculous adventures, and you expected that. That was just the way comic books were at the time. And as a matter of fact, all the superheroes, Superman included, Lois Lane, they were all crazy, zany Silver Age adventures. So Jimmy Olsen was no exception. But in the modern age here, in this modern day of age of comic book writing, it's interesting that we now get very serious Superman stories. We get a very serious Lois Lane comic, but for some reason Jimmy Olsen still remains relegated to the absurd and the fantastical and the crazy and sometimes the borderline stupid sort of plot lines. So I was really hoping that we were going to get just a little bit more of a grounded and serious take on Jimmy Olsen, obviously with humor and comedy, because you expect a little bit of that. But I didn't want it to go full bore in the craziness. Now, here in this opening issue here, it's established that Jimmy Olsen's family basically goes back to the late 1700s, and they were one of the first founding families of Metropolis, which was very interesting. Jimmy Olsen's grandfather, or great whatever grandfather, basically, I don't know, found some mining, or was it gold? In any event, they really made a name for themselves, and ultimately the Olsen family was overshadowed because they lacked the ego of families like the Luthers. Eventually they were overshadowed by the Luthers. And one thing that Matt Fraction has done here is that he's broken up the storyline into various parts, and each individual story here, there's sort of like individual mini stories here that are all linked. And he, instead of, the cover says Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. The first story says Superman's problem, Jimmy Olsen, the pal who fell to Earth, and that's followed by another sort of play on the words of that, which says Jimmy Olsen's boss, Perry White, to clean a little house and force manure. So it's a play on the language of how Jimmy Olsen has been described in the comics in the past. And then the final story was Superman's long-distance best friend forever, Jimmy Olsen. So there's a play on that. So Matt Fraction is having fun with the traditional description of Jimmy Olsen in terms of the title. And I like that. He's sort of thinking outside the box here. I do think that Steve Lieber's art here is just perfectly suited for Jimmy Olsen, so I really, really like that. I think they've done a really good job of getting the sensibility, artistically and stylistically, of Jimmy Olsen. Now, where I think there might be some problems, hints of a problem here in terms of this ongoing narrative that I hope will improve is, it starts, this is playing fast and loose with common sense, and it's playing fast and loose with continuity. We already saw Matt Fraction play fast and loose with continuity when Dexstar, the Red Lantern cat, showed up. in that Leviathan one-shot, because when Dexstar's blood melts and kills people. It's like acid. And Jimmy Olsen was covered with it and he lived. So that didn't make any sense. So that's inconsistent with continuity. It's a little thing, but it's something that I wish the editors would catch. Because, you know, look, I get it, it's a Jimmy Olsen comic. But I think what makes these comic books resonate more with the readership is when you have enough realistic take on it, a good grounding of the continuity, so that when you do deviate and do something crazy with the character, it's, you know, it's okay to be crazy, but I would prefer to be a little bit crazy, but there's no reason why you can't be crazy and zany and also maintain a sense of continuity. Now, Jimmy Olsen volunteers for Star Labs to do an experiment because he's got a website that one of the Jimmy's pals challenged him to jump from outer space to the ground without a parachute, and Jimmy Olsen, as crazy as that request was, he decided to do it because Star Labs needed a volunteer for a medical experiment, and he volunteered for it, and he was infused and injected with some serum for Metamorpho, of all people, and as Jimmy Olsen jumps off Star Labs ship, he metamorphosizes into a turtle, and he's also in danger of exploding. Superman's got to get involved, and in the process of doing that, certain portions of Metropolis are destroyed, including a statue of a lioness, which is linked to Jimmy Olsen and Lex Luthor history. But my point of saying that is that leads into the next bit of information that's provided that I think is very interesting, because Perry White has a conversation with Jimmy Olsen, and he starts the conversation off by telling Jimmy that he's fired. And the reason why Jimmy Olsen is fired, because apparently the Daily Planet's insurance premiums to insure Jimmy Olsen's antics are always very, very high, because whatever Jimmy Olsen gets involved with, it usually involves some destruction, and something goes awry, something goes wrong, and Daily Planet's insurance for insuring their reporter always has to cover it. That's funny, but it doesn't quite make a lot of sense, and I'll say why in a minute. But I just want to add another thing, that not only is that discovered, but it's discovered that Jimmy Olsen brings in the most money for the planet. The only reason that Perry White ultimately decides not to fire him is that Miss Leon, yes, the same Miss Leon that actually runs the Invisible Mafia in Metropolis, Miss Leon owns the Daily Planet. Miss Leon points out to Perry White that in fact that Jimmy Olsen, through his website, affiliated through the Daily Planet, gets so many hits that he actually makes more money for the Daily Planet than the newsprint division does, which is hilarious. But it sort of underscores the absurdity of it, that they have to rely on this kid. So Jimmy Olsen makes more money that actually covers the insurance premium that they pay in order to deal with his antics. Now, having said that, there are all kinds of things that don't make sense. I mean, if Jimmy Olsen is volunteering for Star Labs insurance would be paying for the damage to Metropolis. It would have nothing to do with the Daily Planet's insurance policy, because the Daily Planet had nothing to do with it. So Daily Planet's insurance policy would have nothing to do with something that was clearly run and controlled by Star Labs. So that didn't make any sense there, but it is what it is. It makes for an interesting little story. And then it goes on from there. Now Jimmy Olsen ends up then in a story called Superman's Long-Distance Best Friend Forever, Jimmy Olsen, in town. In any event, he ends up in Gotham, and apparently this series, I think, Jimmy's going to be solving his own murder. And we don't know exactly how the Daily Planet ended up with the headline, "Who Killed Jimmy Olsen?" Obviously, that's going to be revealed, but he ends up hiding out in Gotham City, and again, some gorgeous art here by Steve Lieber. But so Jimmy Olsen trying to solve his own murder, talking to a landlord, a bat-infested tenancy is what he's enduring at the end of this issue. So I'm intrigued to see where this is going to go. I'm going to give Matt Fraction the benefit of the doubt here, only because it took a while for his Hawkeye series to grow on me. So I'm going to give this a few more issues. But overall, it's not bad. It's definitely, decidedly different in tone than Greg Rucka's Lois Lane, which is very interesting when you consider the fact that him and Greg Rucka are essentially both writing about reporters. But in any event, not bad. Tell me what you guys think of Jimmy Olsen number 1. Hit the subscribe button. Follow me on Twitter at Metropolis40. And until next time, Comic Boom out.